Level 1. The Cadet. You don't join for the money. That needs to be said at the beginning, clearly and without apology, because this job is going to ask you that question repeatedly and in ways you won't always recognize as questions, and the honesty of your answer is going to determine exactly what kind of officer you become, or whether you become the kind you had in mind when you signed the application, or something else entirely. Something that doesn't have a clean name yet, but that you've watched take shape in men who started the same way you did. You are 22 years old. Your city has a homicide rate that appears in international reports. You grew up watching what happens when there is no order, what it costs in lives and in dignity and in the kind of childhood that children deserve, and that children in your city are frequently denied. You want order, not as an abstraction, as a concrete consequence of concrete work performed by concrete people who decided to show up and do what is necessary. That is what brought you here. The first day at the academy doesn't look like anything you imagined. There is mud, and there are instructions delivered at a volume designed not to convey information but to produce stress. And there is an instructor who walks the line of recruits with the eyes of a man who has run this specific movie enough times to know precisely which weak half of you will break. He doesn't say it with cruelty. He says it with the clinical indifference of someone stating facts. Half of this formation will not complete the cycle. Not because the process is unjust. Because the process is designed to find exactly that half and separate it from the other before the state hands them a badge and sends them into the street. You do push-ups in the mud until your arms stop responding. That is not a metaphor. It is the specific exercise of a Tuesday morning at 5 a.m. with cold rain and mud that gets into your elbows and your collar and your ears, and an instructor walking behind the line counting out loud with a deliberate slowness that turns each number into a question about how much you can sustain. You reach the moment where your arms have nothing left, and your body begins negotiating with a part of your mind you didn't know existed, the part that argues with apparently reasonable logic that there is no shame in stopping, that there are other ways to serve, that this was not what you imagined. You don't stop, not because you are stronger than everyone else, because the reason you came is larger than the argument your arms are making. That distinction matters. You are going to need it for years. You study law, procedure, the rights of the detained, the legal framework for use of force, the difference between authority and abuse, which in theory is clear and in practice is a line that your environment is going to push you across and back in both directions, constantly, without announcing that it's doing so. You learn to shoot to the standard the state requires of someone it is about to hand a weapon. You learn first aid. You learn to write reports in the institutional language that converts events into documents. You also learn to read your classmates. By the 5th week, you know who will finish and who won't. Not because you've made any formal evaluation, but because conditions like these make something legible in people that civilian life keeps hidden. The way someone handles the specific moment when the body has nothing left and the mind has to make the decision. That says something that no other context provides the opportunity to read. On graduation day, they hand you a badge. It's a piece of metal roughly the size of your palm. It weighs less than it should for something with this level of consequence. You hold it and feel exactly that it weighs more than it weighs. The weight you feel isn't the metal. It's the inventory of everything the metal implies. And that inventory is long enough that you can't see the end of it from here. That doesn't matter. You walk out onto the street with the badge on your chest and the academy in your body and the reason you came still intact, for now, and that will have to be enough. Level 2. The Patrol Officer. Your first night shift begins at 10 p.m. in a sector that the precinct map classifies with a color that in the legend corresponds to high crime incidents, which is the institutional way of saying that things happen here with a frequency and a violence that statistics can measure but cannot prepare you to experience. The veteran assigned to ride with you has 14 years on the force. He doesn't talk much on the first shift. He watches you with the lateral attention of someone who has evaluated many freshly graduated cadets and who knows that useful evaluation isn't done with questions but with time and with situations that reveal what questions can't reach. At the end of the shift, riding back to the station, he tells you one thing. He tells you to forget half of what you learned at the academy. He doesn't specify which half. He says you'll figure it out yourself and that this is better. That there is knowledge produced only through contact with the specific reality of these streets under these conditions, with this level of resources and this chain of command and this political context, and that no classroom can anticipate that knowledge because the classroom exists in a parallel universe to the one you're about to inhabit in this uniform. He is right. It takes you 3 weeks to understand exactly which half. The radio calls come faster than they can be answered, not because the system is broken, because the sector has more incidents than available units, which is an equation the command structure knows about and manages with the same resigned acceptance it applies to any chronic structural gap between demand and capacity. You learn to triage without anyone formally teaching you how. Which calls are urgent in the sense of minutes and which calls are urgent in the sense of when you get there, you get there. The difference between those two categories is a decision you make in fractions of a second with incomplete information and consequences you cannot fully calculate in the moment of making them. The corruption doesn't arrive as a dramatic revelation. It arrives as context, like the temperature of a room that has always been that temperature and that you only perceive as temperature when you come in from outside. It's in the conversations that stop when you enter. It's in the money that changes hands in ways you're not supposed to see, and that you see anyway, and in your veteran's expression when you see it. An expression that neither confirms nor denies, but communicates with precise economy, the information that what you just witnessed has a context you are now part of managing. Plata o plomo, silver or lead. They don't say it to you directly at first. You learn it the way you learn everything in this job, by watching consequences. You see what happens to the officers who refuse. You see what happens to the ones who don't. You watch the specific mechanics by which the environment applies pressure in both directions, with the patience of a system that has had decades to perfect the pressure, and that operates with the confidence of something that knows time is on its side. You learn when to be quiet. The academy taught this too, but abstractly, in the language of professional ethics and chain of command and institutional channels for reporting irregularities. What you learn on the street is concrete and has measurable consequences and carries the specific weight of understanding that what you decide to do or not do in this moment is going to determine things about your safety and the safety of people who don't currently know that their safety depends on this decision. The paranoia starts here, not as illness, as calibration. You begin processing the environment with an additional filter the Academy didn't install, a filter that evaluates every interaction for its potential threat content, that categorizes people not only as citizens in situations, but as risk vectors whose threat profile can change in seconds. You wear a uniform. The uniform is visible in every context where you exist. The visibility of the uniform in this sector, with this homicide rate and this level of cartel penetration into the police structure, has operational consequences that you think about in terms of routes to work and habits in public spaces, and the way your family does or doesn't appear in contexts where you might be observed. You are a target. That's what the veteran was trying to communicate without saying it directly. The Academy prepared you to protect. The street teaches you that in this job, you first have to survive yourself. The order you wanted to create exists, but it exists on the other side of a line that getting there requires you to reach it alive, and to remain on the force, and to remain the person who signed that application for the right reasons, which turns out to be harder to maintain than graduation made it appear. But you stay on shift. Night after night, the same sector, the same veteran, the same streets that begin to develop texture in your memory. The same radio calls with the same patterns you learn to anticipate before the transmission ends. You learn the streets. And the streets learn you. Level 3. The tactical operator. The selection for the tactical unit doesn't begin with a form. It begins with an evaluation nobody formally notifies you of, conducted over months of observation of your field performance, the quality of your decisions under pressure, the way you move during operations, whether panic is something you manage or something that manages you. When someone finally speaks to you about the selection process, you have already been evaluated for some time without knowing it. That architecture is also part of the evaluation. The selection process is physically brutal in ways the Academy didn't fully anticipate. Not because the Academy was easy. Because the tactical selection operates at a different scale of demand, with a different duration and a different intent. They are not training you yet. They are measuring you, with the same precision you'd apply to any material being subjected to extreme conditions, bringing it to its limit to determine exactly where the limit is and what happens when it's reached. The ones who finish are not necessarily the fastest or the strongest. They are the ones who have the specific combination of physical capacity and mental architecture that the work requires. You pass. They issue you the black balaclava. There is a specific moment the first time you put it on, looking at yourself in the locker room mirror before the first operation, where you understand that this is not just tactical equipment. It is a decision about identity. The man in the mirror has no recognizable face. No name that a target could search, no family that an informant could locate. The balaclava is not intimidation, though it is also intimidation. It is protection for the people who live in your house and who didn't choose this job, but who live with its consequences every day. Night operations have their own grammar. You learn it in the first deployments with the speed of learning that comes from being alive as a function of learning correctly. The formation, the order in the stack, the rhythm of entry, the distribution of space in a room you clear with the precision of a mechanism being released, where every movement of every element has a coordination that tolerates no improvisation because improvisation in this context is paid for in blood. The men to your left and right in that stack are the most concrete relationship of trust you have had in your adult life. Not sentimentally, operationally. When you go through that door in the darkness with adrenaline running and the interior situation unknown, the only thing that can compensate for the uncertainty of what's inside is the absolute certainty of what's beside you. That certainty is built over months of shared training and shared operations and the specific moments when someone made a correct decision under pressure, and the result of that correct decision was that everyone came back. You trust them because you have seen what they do when it matters. The intelligence leak is the operational reality nobody discusses openly, but that everyone manages constantly. Operations are planned inside a deliberately small circle for exactly this reason. There are operations where the target is already gone when they arrive, where the structure of the safe house has been modified in ways that don't correspond to the most recent intelligence, where small accumulated signals suggest that someone who had access to the plan converted it into useful information for the wrong side. Not always, not systematically, but with enough frequency that operational paranoia is a work tool rather than a dysfunction. The sicarios on the other side know this too. They exploit it. The people who run La Plaza understand the mechanics of institutional penetration with a clarity that comes from decades of perfecting the practice. They know which elements of which units are accessible and at what price and through what channels. They have invested in that knowledge the same way any organization invests in competitive intelligence. You work inside that reality the same way you work in the dark, and with the element of surprise, and with the unpredictable geometry of the structures you have to clear. As a condition of the environment you can't eliminate and have to incorporate into every plan. The weight of the mask is not the weight of the material, it's the weight of the separation it represents. Inside this work, you are a tactical element with a call sign and an operational history and a position in the formation. Outside this work, you're a person with a family who doesn't know the specific texture of what you do and can't know, and that you have decided shouldn't know, for reasons you can articulate operationally, though you can't always articulate them emotionally when you're sitting at the dinner table, and the conversation turns to things that are completely real and important, and that simultaneously belong to a universe that this week feels very far from the universe where you spent the last 72 hours. You learn to cross that threshold. It takes time. You never fully master it. But you learn to function on both sides and to keep the two versions of yourself separate enough that each can do what it needs to do in the space that belongs to it. That is also part of the work, the most invisible part, and the one that costs the most. Level 4. The Commander. The promotion to Commander doesn't feel like an achievement. It feels like the moment the weight redistributes in a way that will not go back to how it was. The decisions that were yours in the sense of affecting you are now yours in the sense of affecting others, and that change in the direction of impact is a transformation you don't process immediately. You install it gradually as you accumulate the first operations from the side of the person who authorizes them, rather than the person who executes them. You send men into situations you have studied on maps and in intelligence reports and in surveillance footage, knowing that maps are incomplete and reports carry margins of error, and footage shows what was there when it was taken and not necessarily what's there now. You send men who trust your assessment. That trust has a specific weight that no preparation fully absorbs. You can do everything correctly. The most current intelligence possible, the most rigorous planning, the most capable team, the most favorable timing, every variable you can control controlled at its maximum. And there is one variable you don't control. They call it the unknown factor in technical language. The element that doesn't appear in any report because it doesn't exist until the second it exists. There is an operation in which someone on your team doesn't come back, not in the sense of coming back injured. In the other sense, the definitive one, the one that has no recovery protocol. You write the report, you make the call to the family, you attend the funeral carrying the specific weight of knowing that the decision to send that man on that night was yours, that the circumstances were the circumstances of this work, and that any honest analysis would say you did what the situation called for, and that honest analysis changes absolutely nothing about the weight you carry from that moment forward. You learn to carry it, not because you found a method that makes it manageable, because the work continues and the men who are still here still need the same level of decision and presence and authority they needed before, and the only way to give it to them is to continue. The political pressure arrives from below and above simultaneously. The mayor wants results he can announce at a press conference. The governor wants operations that don't produce human rights complaints that complicate his relationships with federal agencies. The mid-level commanders want the unit to maintain its effectiveness rate because the effectiveness rate is the argument that justifies the budget. Your own men want to know that the decisions sending them into the field are based on real intelligence and clear objectives and not on someone's electoral calendar. And underneath all of that is the suspicion, sometimes confirmed, sometimes not, that some of the officials applying that political pressure are themselves on the cartel payroll. That the mayor who calls asking for results may have a relationship with La Plaza that predates his relationship with the law. That the intelligence that reaches you sometimes has a shape to it that suggests it was passed through a filter you didn't choose and can't fully see. You navigate all of it, not always well. Not always without making concessions that cost more than they cost the first time you make them. But there is a line you drew when you were a patrol officer, and that the years in the tactical unit reinforced, and that the command position has not erased. There are things you will not do for any combination of political pressure and institutional convenience and professional self-preservation. That line has to be held from the top, especially from the top. The isolation of leadership is not a cliché. It is a functional description of what happens to a person's experience of themselves when the decisions they make carry consequences for other people's lives. And you cannot fully share the weight of those consequences with anyone who hasn't been in the same position, because the position produces a specific kind of knowledge that doesn't transmit completely through description. Your men respect you. There is a distance in that respect that is unavoidable and would be a mistake to try to eliminate, because the distance is part of what makes the respect functional as a command instrument. Your family loves you with a completeness that has no reservations, but that also doesn't have full access to the parts of you this work has built, and that this work requires and that don't fit completely in the domestic space. You exist in the space between those two worlds, carrying the weight of both. You learn to exist in that space, not because it's comfortable, because that's where you have to be to do what needs doing. Level 5. The quiet retirement. There is a day when you turn in the badge. There is no ceremony in any sense the word normally implies. There is an office and a desk and a superior who processes the paperwork with the same administrative tone he would use for any other human resources transaction. And there is a handshake that lasts as long as a handshake lasts. And then there is a hallway. And then there is a door. And then there is a street. The street is the same street that leads to your house. You've walked it hundreds of times. The difference you feel this time is the absence of the weight on your hip where the weapon rode. It's not that the weight is gone. It's that it shifted to a location with no physical coordinates that doesn't correspond to any point on the body you can indicate. That is simply in you in a way that has nothing to do with any equipment you can remove. The badge was a piece of metal. What it represented was not. The first weeks at home are a kind of reverse learning. You spent decades training your body and your mind to a specific state of readiness, and that state has no power switch, because a power switch would have been a point of operational vulnerability during all the years when vulnerability had measurable consequences. Now the state is no longer necessary in the same way, and the body hasn't received that notification yet. You still choose the seat facing the door. Not deliberately. Your body selects the position that gives visibility to the entrance before your mind has articulated the preference. You notice it. You let it happen. There's no point fighting something you spent decades installing in the motor system. You call it a habit because calling it something else would imply a processing you're not sure you're ready to do completely. In public spaces, you still classify. There is still a process running without your activating it consciously. Evaluating the people in your visual field according to parameters you learned on patrol and refined in the tactical unit, and that no longer have the same context, but that the nervous system still applies, because that's how processes work when they were installed under sufficient pressure over sufficient time. It is not paranoia in any clinical sense. It is the cost of having been where you were for as long as you were there. You think about the ones who didn't make it to retirement, not constantly. Not in a way that stops you, in specific ways at specific moments that have a logic you can't always trace consciously. A smell, a time of day, a quality of light at a particular moment in the year, a name that surfaces without your having intended to recall it, a face that appears in the space between sleep and waking without announcement. You owe them the retirement, not abstractly. Concretely and specifically, you are here and they are not. And that is a debt with no payment method that also doesn't disappear simply because there is no payment method. You carry it. You will always carry it. The silence of the house in the morning has a texture you take time to learn to inhabit. Decades of night shifts and operational pre-dawn hours, and the specific quality of noise that belongs to a work environment that was never fully quiet left you without practice for real silence, which is different from the silence that exists between situations. You learn that silence gradually, with the same patience with which you learned everything else in this work. You think about the reason you entered. It is still the same reason. Order. The concrete consequence of concrete work done by concrete people who decided to show up and do what is necessary. Not everything you did over these years was perfect. Not every decision you made under pressure with incomplete information was the decision you would have made with time and full information. There are things you would do differently. There are things you could not have done differently because the environment did not allow it. Both of those categories are also part of what you carry. But there is order where there wasn't, not only in the abstract sense. In the concrete sense, there are operations you ran that dismantled networks that would otherwise have continued operating. There are people alive because someone wearing a black balaclava went through a door in the dark and made a correct decision under pressure. There are officers you trained who are still in the field doing the same work with the same level of discipline and with the same right reasons. That doesn't cancel anything it cost, but it is real, and the reality of it belongs to the inventory of what this work was. The quiet ending was always the objective, not in the sense that everything you did was aimed at arriving here. In the sense that arriving here without having broken, without having crossed the line, without having turned the work into something different from what it was when you started, was the measure of success that mattered more than any institutional metric or performance evaluation or commendation. You are here. The badge is in a drawer. The weapon was surrendered. The work belongs to someone else now. You are a civilian. The door of the restaurant is still the first thing you see when you walk in. That is also the price. You paid it. It was worth it.